Jordan Peterson recently released a debate with Richard Dawkins, moderated by Alex O'Connor, titled Memes and Archetypes. Now, it covered a lot of stuff beyond memes that I will be getting into. I thought the debate was fascinating, so I figured I would give my own take, cover some of the arguments. A lot of it ended up being focused on Jordan Peterson, because he said a lot of interesting things throughout the conversation. But it's a new kind of content that I'm trying out, so please let me know if you enjoy it. And without further ado, let's get into it.
Dr. Peterson, you're drunk on symbols.
Yes, you mentioned. I've heard that comment.
You don't believe Cain actually existed, I presume.
Pattern that Cain represents is an eternal pattern. A silly question. I think it's like asking whether Raskolnikov existed in Crime and Punishment. You can answer yes, and you can answer no. You can say, well, there was no such specific person as Raskolnikov. But it's not a helpful question, because the reason that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a masterpiece is because Raskolnikov was everywhere in Russia. Raskolnikov is hyper-real, not real.
But to be clear, is that how you feel about Cain and Abel? That identifiable
I think they're hyper-real.
Homo sapiens called Cain,
it's irrelevant.
who murders his brother?
In a sense, it's irrelevant to me, because
Jordan Peterson brings up this idea of hyperrealism here. And I don't think that this is the typical definition of hyperrealism. I think that's an actual word with an actual definition. But, you can kind of read into what he means when he says that. His point being that because the character sheet or the template that is represented by the conflict between Cain and Abel and the story of Cain and Abel is so prevalent and pervasive throughout human experience, it is more than real. It is more real than if the story was explicitly about a pair of brothers, Cain and Abel. I mean, there's definitely merit in that argument. I think it's probably true to a large extent. I don't know if hyperreal would be the word I would use, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. Of course, that's not the question he's being asked. I think there's a bit of, it seems like when he gets these questions, there's hesitation to answer in an explicit and straightforward manner, almost as if by giving a simple answer, he would be undercutting the meaning of the story. If that is what's going on, it's kind of silly, because he mentions then he brings up Raskolnikov, an analogy to the story of Cain and Abel. But us knowing that the story of Crime and Punishment in literal interpretation did not happen doesn't take away from the meaning of the fictional work. You will still learn a lot from reading fictional stories, despite knowing that those specific events did not take place.
But even if they were real, we don't know anything about them as historical figures.
Of course, even if they weren't real, of course they weren't real.
Well, like I said, it could have been the case that when the story originated, way back when it originated, that the first people that were described by the first person who generated the seeds of the Cain and Abel story were referring to actual people. But it doesn't matter, because the text is being compressed and modified over a vast span of time, and it's accreted all sorts of meanings that certainly weren't part and parcel of whatever the original story was.
Peterson now brings up a pretty interesting point regarding the realness that you can attribute to any character from the past. Obviously, the example he gives is, if Cain and Abel was originally written about two brothers, we don't actually know anything about them. We don't know if their names were actually Cain and Abel, but the story could have originated that way. I think it's interesting because you can see this with any historical figure, including less controversial ones. We have evidence really existed. When you think of someone like Leonardo da Vinci, all the things that in our minds we attribute to him, or even in the history books attribute to him, are probably not all true. It's probably not all his work or his design or his sketch or his words. And there are things that he did that weren't captured by history. So as a representation, how real is the character in our mind or in our history books in comparison to the actual man that was Leonardo da Vinci. I think that's a pretty fair argument when arguing against the general validity of the question whether any given story in the Bible or any literary historical literary piece, how can you really ask that question when to some degree we know that there's fiction involved? There's always fiction involved. So I definitely think Professor Dawkins didn't have quite enough clarity to the question or open-mindedness to how the question might be interpreted, because Jordan's answer in this specific instance regarding the validity of the basis of not whether the story is true, but whether the characters are real is pretty fair, because how can you really know if the characters are real? How can you really know any historical figure is real in the way that you think they are? A person that your story may be about existed, right? Even people we have videos of or pictures of, even people who are alive today, the people that you see on TV are not anything like in person, if you're a friend of theirs, how they are to a third party watching them through the TV or reading about them through a book or an article. Yeah, I can sympathize with Jordan Peterson's frustration in that regard. I think Professor Dawkins' question could be a little bit more refined.
I think that there's a spirit of literary genius at work across millennia, crafting that story so that it has almost an infinite depth. How that relates to the original author or sequential authors, I don't know, because it's lost in the seeds of time.
So the story evolved, you're saying the story...
Like a meme. Yes, it
well,
evolved.
That's interesting.
It evolved to match the contours of the human memory. But as they propagated across time, they also evolved so they're maximally memorable. And they're maximally memorable for a biological reason.
Well, that's very interesting. If they really did evolve over time, if you could actually trace successive manuscripts, you can't do that.
You can see here that Dawkins is actually pretty surprised by Peterson's answer. And I mean, the reason for that is you wouldn't typically expect someone who considers himself a Christian to think of the Bible as, I mean, they're specifically referring to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, as a work of iteration, something that grew over time, and that it wasn't, an instance of, divine revelation to some writer or prophet or something like that. The idea is, related to what the whole concept of the conversation or the title of the conversation is, memes and archetypes. And I think Jordan's argument here is that these stories evolved over time, and the stories that didn't make it, we don't know about. And the stories that did make it, made it because they were relevant in a unique way that not only were enjoyable or meaningfully imbibed by the population or the culture at that time, but also the story's positive feedback loop on the population caused the population to succeed. Maybe that's not exactly what he's saying, but that's kind of my own interpretation of the idea that he's putting out there. So over time, these stories would get better. Maybe in the original story of, for example, Cain and Abel, Cain didn't kill Abel, or there was like an actual dispute and it wasn't like a meaningless murder, or maybe, there's plenty of alterations that you could make to the story, and to end up with the version that we have now, theoretically in this view of how the story came to be, or how all of the stories came to be, it was perfected over time, not on purpose, but almost like as a side effect of like the natural selection of stories and their effects on the cultures that tell these stories. Take that idea to the logical extreme of like extruded perfection over millennia of these stories getting better and better. I wonder what Dr. Peterson thinks with regard to the fact that the canon is now closed in most Abrahamic religions. All right, so these stories can't change anymore. Obviously, there are still sects of like Christianity, for example, where they are open to adding new texts or changing texts and stuff like that. But now that the canon is closed, these stories stop evolving, right? They become less and less relevant. For example, all of the rhetoric surrounding slavery in the Old Testament, no longer relevant. Now, will that ever change? Probably not in any orthodox sect of Judaism or Christianity, because they're not going to change the texts. They just kind of change their interpretation or choose not to read those parts, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I'm agnostic. But I am curious what he thinks of that, because now these stories can no longer evolve. They may be kind of perfect for our time, although conceptually you would imagine that as these stories get more and more refined, they're also lagging behind the modern day, because they change to adapt to the current day as the current day has passed. So there's always a lag time between how relevant the story is and what would potentially be the perfect story for the present moment. When you go back to the early AD, we see iterations in different versions and different sects of Christianity at the very beginning that held different texts, that had different Gospels. All of the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnostic stuff that was eventually fell out of favor. The mainstream, or what became mainstream, because at the time all of those people would have considered themselves Christians, but what became the mainstream types of Christianity left those texts out, right? So there was still this continuous evolution of the stories that mattered, the stories that fit, the stories that were going to develop whatever traits were most valuable at that time. But now that process is dead. I would imagine as time continues to go on, another 1,000 or 2,000 years continue, and you hold to the belief that there can be no updates to canon, there can be no additional prophets or no additional books or changes, and you stick with the same text, eventually, from an anthropological perspective, you would expect the stories to lose relevance and lose meaning to the population, because how relevant is slavery when it's 2,000 years from now and we don't have slaves and we have no concept of slaves and we all live in virtual reality? What is that text? The text has no relevance whatsoever. Or someone dying for your sins, maybe in 2,000 years, the concept of death is gone. We can reanimate anyone. You don't die of old age or anything. So these concepts would eventually lose meaning, and then the text itself as a whole would lose meaning because it doesn't adapt. The sects that do evolve over time would eventually become the mainstream versions of those religions or new religions or something like that.
And you criticized the biblical text at one point. Correct me if I've got this wrong, because I don't want to get this wrong. You said that there isn't anything in the biblical text that constitutes, let's say, significant original discovery, which is something that you'd expect if it was of divine provenance. I was thinking about that objection, and I think that one of the discoveries that the text lays bare in an insanely brilliant manner is that the foundation of the community is sacrifice.
Okay, so the criticism is the Bible as a text gives us nothing to indicate that it has divine origin. There's nothing that we can read in it where we think there's no way this idea could have evolved were it not divinely put into this text. That's a criticism that perhaps
is that
Professor
what you
Dawkins
think?
made in the...
Alex does a really good job of clarifying the argument here. Jordan Peterson is essentially saying that these values that can be extracted from the text and these foundational principles, like the principle of sacrifice, are so profound that they are coming from a place of divinity. And they are the equivalent of a scientific revelation that a lot of critics of the Bible would say would need to be there for you to imagine it to be divine, right? There has to be some kind of new information. Otherwise, you're just like looking at text that's clearly written by a person. Dawkins' counter-argument here is that there's nothing like that. And I would have to agree with Professor Dawkins here. Peterson says this principle of sacrifice is a foundational part of community and culture and civilization, essentially, which is true, but I don't see how that principle, or the fact that it shows up thematically throughout the Old and the New Testament, means that it's divine. And later on, in a second, really, he'll go into what he really means by divine. But it seems like kind of a cop-out answer. Sacrifice existed before the New Testament, before the Old Testament, so I don't really see what he's getting at. Like, it is profound lesson to be learned. It's one of the many valuable lessons that are in the Bible as a whole. But to say that revelation, I guess is what he would call it, or that point of learning is so profound that it must come from a divine source, I think is a stretch. You have countries, all over the world at this point in history. All of them have a sense of sacrifice, and I wouldn't say that Jewish or Christian communities were exclusively or uniquely apt to sacrifice. If you go to cultures all over Africa or Eastern Asia or Central Asia, I mean, if you go anywhere in the world, people are living in communities and city-states and countries where they sacrifice. Yes, there are other places where there's brutality and it's mayhem, but there are plenty of places around the world prior to even the Old Testament that already have functional civilizations, that already have a concept of sacrifice and its importance. I don't think the Bible does anything unique in that regard. The story of Prometheus in, the Greek mythology, which we call a mythology, that's, very similar to Garden of Eden story with Prometheus, giving knowledge and fire to man so that they, they're not just animals anymore, or clay in that case. But I mean, there's all these other religious stories that predate the religious text being referenced here that have very similar themes. And you could say, and I imagine Jordan Peterson would argue that they're not quite as refined of stories, but one, I don't know if that's really true, right? I think that's probably just a bias because that's the religion that he's found, or the text he's most familiar with and is most comfortable with. But also, there's plenty of texts, like Hindu is generally considered the oldest, at least continually practiced religion. And, they still fast, they still do these things that are mentioned in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I'm definitely a little bit lost as to why he thinks, especially just the concept of sacrifice, is so special in the Bible.
Reflective of some order that's so profound and implicit that there isn't a better way of describing it than divine. But I don't really care if we look at that from the bottom up, like as a biological phenomena, or as from the top down. I don't think it makes any difference.
It doesn't make a difference whether it was divinely inspired or whether it evolved within human.
Let me ask you this. I think that at bottom, truth is unified. And what that's going to mean eventually is that the world of value and the world of fact coincide in some manner that we don't yet understand. And I think that union, the fact of that union, and the fact of that union is equivalent to what's being described as divine order across millennia. There's no difference. You either believe that the world of truth is unified in the final analysis, or you don't. Those are the options. And if it's not unified, then there's a contradiction between different sets of values and they can't be brought into a unity. I don't believe that.
You implied there's no difference between whether the text is divinely inspired or whether it evolved. Now, I think that's genuinely interesting, but it's a huge difference. It's not the same thing. I mean, either it was divinely inspired or it wasn't.
Truth is unified. It's an interesting statement. Terms he's using here are kind of vague. When he says the world of value and the world of fact become unified, my best interpretation of this is that for value, I would maybe substitute moral or ethic, and that in the combination, in the unification, at some point you can find a factual basis for ethic, a factual basis for morality, which is an interesting concept. I believe Alex O'Connor is, I think it's called a moral emotivist or an ethical emotivist, where you're feelings of morality are essentially expressions of emotion. But this is very different. This is essentially saying that one day we will solve some kind of factual problem. I don't know what he means by that, if he means like a mathematical problem or something, but we will be able to prove right from wrong without the basis of, I don't know. I really, it's an interesting concept, and I'm curious why he thinks that. Right? It's kind of the same, although to a different scale, as saying you could factually prove that one writer writes more beautifully than another. Prove factually, that's the one side, and then there's the value side, which is the beauty, the interpretive side. And I just don't think that that's true. And there may be a case, on an individual level, at an individual moment, but people's morality changes, maybe not on a daily basis, but throughout their lives. So the idea that there is an answer, pinnacle, a perfect code of ethics or morality that can be exercised in every context, or at least has an answer for every context, there's no holes in it, seems a bit odd to me, and I'm not sure why he believes that. And Richard Dawkins doesn't respond, probably because either he doesn't really understand what Peterson is talking about, or because it's kind of an out there idea, or it's not like a widely accepted idea that you can factually prove value or through value prove facts. I mean, even when you use factual information, something as basic as math, there's still an underlying axiom or an underlying unknown, which is that maybe this is repeatable. Maybe I can do 1 + 1 = 2 an infinite number of times and I get the right answer, but on some level it's just not true out there in the universe somewhere, or just innately in the universe it's just not true, but it is functionally how things work. So it's kind of an odd argument to posit, but he makes it. The other very interesting thing that he mentions here, that he doesn't believe there's a difference between divinity and the natural evolution of ideas through people. Say Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, when that song was first written, I don't know how old it is, probably didn't say exactly the same words, probably didn't sing it at the exact same notes or the same speed or anything like that, but over generations and time, it has resulted in something that is part of the cultural zeitgeist. It stays with us now. I also think it's interesting because that's not typically, I don't think that's what a typical Christian would answer to the question of whether the Bible is of divine origin or iterated upon stories, essentially, which in and of itself is an interesting answer. The main problem I would say I have with his statement here is, if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson in the past, I think it's been a little bit different when he's talking about the religious stuff as he has been the past year or so. Usually he'll take a lot of time and, to some people's chagrin, put in a lot of effort to define terms. It can sound pedantic and annoying and like you're getting nothing burger answers. He'll often say, like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by order? What do you mean by hierarchy? What do you mean by patriarchy? All of these things. And he will sit there in a conversation and define term after term after term to make sure everyone in the conversation is using not just the same words, but the same meanings. They're conveying as similar as possible concepts to each other so that it's a level playing field. What I find frustrating with Dr. Peterson when he talks about religion a lot of the time is that all goes away and he'll be super vague. And it's another one of these instances, because he's been asked questions like this before and has given non-answers, and in this case we're finally getting some kind of straightforward answer. In the past, when he's used terms such as divinity, the best you can do is assume he uses them in the same way that anyone else would use them, in the colloquial sense. But now we're learning in the moment that when he says divinity, he doesn't even differentiate that from essentially drafts of a religious text. If as long as it got better over time, that to him is the equivalent of divinity, which is not the definition of divinity. So it just seems kind of, I won't say intellectually dishonest, because I don't know him. I don't know what's actually going through his head, but it just seems kind of iffy to explicitly use a term in a way that most people would use the term, but means something else. Because when he's telling people he believes in divinity, he doesn't believe in what they believe in. Not even close. This is an example of more of an artistic sense. How you can say even an atheist can say that there's like divinity in artwork. There's some level of something you can't describe in the fact that a human can create something so beautiful or so impactful. But that's not the same whatsoever as saying that there's like a God that controls things or made the universe or that dictated this text. So it's a little off-putting that he's been so opaque about his belief in this way. He's a person, he doesn't owe anybody an explanation, but it just seems kind of weird to talk so publicly about something in a way that's very misleading. If you were to ask someone what they thought Jordan Peterson thought divinity was for this conversation, you would have no inclination that it was a definition that is, not found anywhere else, right? It's his own unique definition that he refused to define, that goes against what his usual habits are, which is to define as many terms as possible to be on a level playing field during a conversation. A similar example would be if I am showing up to a Christmas party and I tell everyone I'm going to bring them red sweaters, and then I show up and I bring an assortment of blue and yellow and white and black sweaters. And people are like, oh, well, I thought you were bringing red sweaters for everyone. What the heck? And then I go and say, well, by red, I just really meant not green, all right? Because in principle, red is the other Christmas color. It is the not green of Christmas. So by saying I'm going to bring red, what I'm really saying is I'm going to bring not green. So I've just made up this own definition that you can kind of see where I get it from, but in my communication to everyone else, I have not explained it all. Very interesting that he said that. I'm surprised this is the first time that we've heard anything about it, because he's been talking about these religious subjects for quite a while now, and you would expect that if his beliefs around this stuff were so starkly different than the colloquial belief, he would have made it clear much earlier on with how much he talks about this stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this slightly different content today. I've really enjoyed putting it together, and I will probably be putting out additional episodes. I don't think I made it through very much of the debate, so definitely plenty of content to go over for future occasions. Let me know if you're interested in this kind of stuff, and I will look for more debates and conversations to talk over, to give my own personal takes and review. But until next time, keep an open mind.